For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, the Sopwith Camel becomes the most dangerous dogfighter.
Once you've mastered this plane, it's a killer.
The Germans unleash a scourge with their Fokker Eindecker.
They decimated the Royal Flying Corps at the time.
The Allies launched the Spitfire of its time, the SE-5.
The SE-5A was one of the most successful fighters in the First World War.
Baron von Richthofen and his flying Circus ruled the skies.
He would pick out the weakest and go after them quite ruthlessly.
America's ace of aces, Eddie Rickenbacker.
It was an incredible feat, you know. He was taking on 7 aircraft, just one man.
Takes on the deadliest fighters of World War I.
No one had ever seen anything like this before.
It was the dawn of aviation when the world went to war in 1914. Daring young men took to the skies in flying machines and blazed a trail for a radically new type of battle.
This is the first time men have fought in the air. It's a new dimension of aerial warfare.
These young men had to learn this and learn this very quickly or they wouldn't live through it.
The first combat aviators had to master the rapidly evolving technology.
The development during the First World War in aviation was immense. If you look at the aeroplanes that first went to the Western Front in 1914 compared to the aeroplanes that were there in 1918, the development on both sides is huge.
With nearly 1,300 kills to its name, the British Sopwith Camel, introduced in 1916, was the most successful close-range aerial combat aircraft of the First World War.
The Sopwith Camel has rightly earned the reputation of the greatest dogfighter in the war because of its incredible maneuverability, the ability to turn on a dime.
What made it special was the fact that it was almost impossible to fly. It had its own mind, and the plane would do strange things. It was very unstable, and that was very handy in a dogfight, because you didn't know what was going to happen, and neither did the enemy. It went all over the place.
It's a turning, spinning combat arena. It's superlative. And so once you've mastered this plane, it's a killer.
At the dawn of aerial combat, the Aviator was lionized.
There was this romantic myth of the Aviator. The Aviator was, in fact, a new man. He had conquered the air. He roamed the heavens completely free. He could fight, give battle at his own initiative, refuse battle.
They were pioneering, they were brave. You could argue that they were brave and foolish at the same time, because these machines were just held together with bits of string.
In reality, flying in an open cockpit World War I aircraft was brutal, harsh, and deadly.
You're flying at 100 miles an hour, so you've got the sound of the wind, you've got the cold, very cold. These airplanes dogfighted at 17,000, 18,000 feet with no heat and no oxygen, and they were up there 45 minutes. extremely cold. You had the castor oil blowing into your face and you were ingesting castor oil. It was a nasty business.
In Britain, among the first to be called for the rare duty as an aviator were former cavalry officers.
At the start of the First World War, to become a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, the main requisite was you rode a horse.
Many of the would-be aviators learnt to fly in a Sopwith Camel, purposely designed with the cavalry officer in mind.
If you look in all World War I airplanes, they all have some form of stirrup. And then they have also a saddle. You mount it just like you mount your horse. You stick your left leg in here, you swing your leg over the saddle, and you mount your steed.
They soon learned, however, that taking hold of the reins of a World War I fighter required a brand new skill set.
There were no two-seat models of these airplanes, so there's only one seat in it. You're your own instructor. You have to go up in the airplane, you have to figure it out yourself because there's nobody that can help you. One of the things that they learned right on is you have to keep your head moving, and you have to look for the target all the time. They move their necks constantly to the point where it would wear a rash in their neck. So they put silk scarves around their necks so the uniform wouldn't wear their neck. The oil is splashing in their eyes all the time, so they would take the end of the scarf and they would wipe the oil off their goggles. And it can make the difference between life and death. If you had an oil spot on your goggle that was blocking the enemy, you'd never see him coming.
Of the 14,000 British pilots killed in the course of the Great War, 8,000 died in training on Britain's airfields.
The early pupils got into spins and they couldn't control them.
In inexperienced hands, the immense power or torque produced by the Camel's rotary engine often proved fatal.
The engine had high inertia, it had high torque, so it could throw a huge propeller, which gave a lot of thrust for a low horsepower. The engines were between 80 horsepower and 140 horsepower. By today's standard, that's not very powerful at all. But if you look at the propeller that these engines swung, they're gigantic.
Student pilots got accustomed to the sound of one of their brethren spinning in from altitude. They could hear him coming down, and you hear whirring, 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 and you knew what was going to happen. He's just going to bury himself in the ground with the Camel, and they'd say, there goes another one.
Getting the balance right between stability and maneuverability while producing an effective combat plane was the preeminent challenge for the early aircraft designers.
From the Wright brothers on, from 1903 to beginning of the war in 1914, all designers around the world were trying to create an aircraft that was stable. The war comes along and the aircraft turns into a war machine, and now you're fighting with these machines. Well, you don't want a stable fighting machine. You want something that's very maneuverable. So how do you make an airplane maneuverable without making it unstable? And they just did not know how to do it.
With the war raging between the world's great economic powers, including Britain, France and Russia on the one side, and Germany and Austria-Hungary on the other, there was no time to wait for the perfect aircraft design. Would-be pilots simply had to learn to fly highly unstable planes or die trying. And after about 20 hours of training, those Allied pilots that survived were deemed ready for one of the most hazardous duties. But at the beginning of the war in 1914, there were very few British aircraft to speak of.
They had some 50 to 60 airplanes ready to serve in France, all of very early versions of what we call the BE-2, which was the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2.
Main combat role in the BE-2 during the First World War was observation. It was the first purpose-designed military airplane, and it was designed as the eyes of the army.
The Royal Aircraft Factory's BE-2 had an 8-cylinder engine producing about 90 horsepower and a top speed of 72 miles an hour. The primitive plane didn't win any plaudits for its raw power. What made it a useful combat tool was that it had a range of 234 miles. That's roughly the distance between London and Paris. and the BE-2 could fly as high as 10,000 feet.
The BE-2 was actually designed to be a very stable aeroplane and for that purpose fairly controllable, and that made it ideal for its role in observation. But in terms of today, it was still a very, very basic aeroplane. Limited instruments, virtually no instruments in some cases, and very limited controls.
They didn't even have cameras to photograph the enemy positions they'd been sent to observe.
They would have literally drawn on a pad and paper the German gun positions, the lines of the trenches, troop positions, and it wasn't then until later in the war that they actually then fixed actual cameras to the side of the aeroplane so they could photograph the German positions.
It was only a matter of time before it was decided that, well, they might as well arm them with bombs and bomb the targets directly. So once you have these aircraft bombing over the lines, then of course comes the need to shoot down and counter those bombers. That led to the need for fighter aircraft.
This led to the development of an airplane that was capable of shooting an airplane down.
As both sides ramped up production for an air war, Germany's leading designer, Antony Fokker, seized the initiative and introduced the world's first combat-ready fighter plane, the Eindecker.
The word Eindecker is German for single wing. It's a single wing aircraft. The name Fokker is associated with Antony Fokker, who was an aircraft designer, and he designed quite a number of German aircraft during the war.
It was the first German killing machine. It was not necessarily faster, but it had a very tight turn, so it could turn inside the enemy aircraft. But the real reason, of course, that it was so special was that Antony Fokker, he invented what is called the interrupter gear. In other words, machine guns that could fire through the propellers.
In effect, the interrupter gear stopped the machine gun from firing for a fraction of a second as the blades of the propeller swept past the machine gun barrel. The weapon of choice was the Spandau machine gun. With a gun platform mounted in a fixed forward position, the airplane was now a game-changing offensive weapon.
The fact that the pilot could literally just point the aeroplane and shoot the machine gun at the same time made it an accurate killing machine. They decimated the Royal Flying Corps at the time. A big bloodbath. The BE-2s just became known as Fokker fodder because they just could not get out of the way. They weren't equipped to deal with it. They just had no defense against them.
The Eindecker's total command of the air began in the autumn of 1916. The massacre of the Allied aircraft and pilots that would follow would become known as the Fokker Scourge.
They're just shooting down aircraft all over the Western Front, and the British continued to send their observation planes and their fighter planes over German lines, and they get shot down in great numbers.
Over the course of the war, some 1,000 British and French aircraft were destroyed by Eindeckers. Most went down in flames. Life expectancy for an Allied pilot was short. 40 to 60 hours of flying time, just a few weeks at best.
The airplanes were made out of fabric, out of Irish linen. They were doped with a nitrate dope that was very flammable, so these airplanes would burst into flames. Parachutes were available. They had parachutes. They weren't allowed to wear them. And both sides said it would be the coward's way out. You wouldn't fight to the death if you could jump out of the airplane. So the pilots, not having any parachutes, would dive as fast as they could and try to get on the ground before the airplane burned up. And that was called going down in flames.
The Fokker Scourge was, of course, a shock for the British and the French on the Western Front. The Fokker Eindecker managed to sweep the skies of British and French aircraft. The Fokker Scourge marked a period of technological advantage for the Germans and their air service. In many respects, this was a case of them just being ahead of the curve.
The Germans took full advantage of their technological superiority.
British and French pilots are confronted with these men flying straight at them, approaching from different angles, and all of a sudden opening fire and shooting them down. It has a terrifying impact.
One of the most celebrated Fokker Eindecker pilots was German ace Max Immelmann, also known as the Eagle of Lille.
To become an ace in the German Air Force, you had to shoot down 5 aircraft or more. Max Immelmann was one of the German fighter aces in the First World War.
Immelmann was your classic Prussian reserved gentleman, didn't talk to anybody, he was very isolated, ice cold.
Max Immelmann claimed his first kill in the Eindecker, shooting down a French pilot. But the audacious way he did it would send a chill down the spines of the Allied flyers and further change the course of aerial combat.
Max Immelmann, he invented the Immelmann turn, which was a way of having 2 shots at an enemy aircraft. If you were heading towards an enemy aircraft and you were shooting at it, he would then climb up, turn, and then as the other aircraft had gone past, he'd then be on the tail of the enemy aircraft and would have another shot at it. So it was quite a useful manoeuvre.
Perfected in World War I, the Immelmann turn is still used by jet fighters today. In all, the German ace Max Immelmann would claim 15 kills before his luck ran out.
Initially, a British crew claimed they had shot him down, but as it turns out, it appears that Immelmann's synchronizing gear failed him in midair and he shot his own propeller off and fell to his death.
Immelmann's demise did little to slow the Fokker scourge. But when a German pilot was forced to land in Allied-held territory, the Eindecker's secrets were exposed.
The German army forbid that a pilot flies into foreign countries. One pilot was landing in France, and 1 week later, the success of the development was gone.
By reverse engineering the captured Eindecker, the Allies learned how to build a synchronized firing gear. So in 1916, the British produced their own fighter plane, the Bristol F-2B.
The Bristol F-2B is the superb long-range reconnaissance fighter that the British developed at the end of 1916. It will be perfected in 1917 and 1918. It uses preferably a Rolls-Royce 275 horsepower Falcon engine. It's got a top speed of over 120 miles an hour. You have a rear gunner who can keep enemy planes off your tail.
The Bristol F-2B was a 2-seater. It was armed like the Eindecker, but the new British fighter had twice the firepower.
One of the key aspects about the Bristol fighter was that it combined aspects of fighters with that of reconnaissance aircraft. So for example, it mounted Vickers machine guns through a synchronized firing gear, firing through the arc of the propeller. It also mounted a Lewis machine gun on a scarf ring at the back.
The Fokker Eindecker had a worthy adversary at last.
What happens is there are cycles of one side gaining dominance with a new aircraft and then the other side then leapfrogging that with their own better aircraft. And so the ebb and flow of aerial warfare really follows the introduction into service of progressively more effective aircraft.
But while the technology was in place, the Allied pilots were still way behind the curve when it came to battle tactics. That was largely thanks to some ingenious rules of engagement created by the German ace with the most kills during the Fokker scourge, Oswald Belker.
Oswald Belker is away from the front after Max Immelmann is shot down. He returns with a set of hand-picked pilots, include Manfred von Richthofen, and he comes back with what are called the Dicta Belki, Belki's Dicta. The first is to seek the advantage, which means you try to get behind and above, or behind and below your opponent. Then you press your attack. Keep your focus on your enemy at all times. Use the sun and keep the sun at your back.
Now, if the sun is in your favor, you always try to keep the sun at your back so that the enemy has to see through the sun to see you, and you can hide in the sun. And they had this saying back then, beware of the Hun in the sun. You want to sneak up on the enemy and surprise him and shoot him before he even knows you're there. So if you could get below your enemy's tail feathers, if you could get down below him, he cannot see you, and then get up high enough to fire, that is the best way to attack your enemy.
Belker's rules also prescribe defensive tactics that have proved effective for pilots to this day.
The other thing finally is that when you're fighting over enemy territory, always keep your line of retreat. Always make certain you have an escape route and leave if the fight turns against you.
It was the German pilots trained by Oswald Belker that the newly minted British fighters had to face. In spring 1917, on their first ever mission over enemy territory, the British Bristol fighters would run into the most formidable foe imaginable.
Unfortunately, the first 6-plane unit that goes out over the German lines meets a disaster when it runs into Richthofen's unit.
Baron Manfred von Richthofen is deemed to be the greatest ace of the First World War.
Von Richthofen, the German ace, who would soon be known infamously as the Red Baron, would claim 80 Allied kills.
If you're a young British pilot and you turned around and you saw 3 red wings coming up from behind your tail, that was probably the last thing you were ever going to see. What made him the #1 ace of World War I is he was a fantastic marksman, a fantastic shot.
He loved the hunt. He loved to go out and chase boar, shoot boar, and he took that into the skies. He was a ruthless killer who would wipe out anybody who came in front of him.
He would pick out the weakest aircraft in the formation and go after them quite ruthlessly.
But von Richthofen was not infallible.
Richthofen, he's actually wounded in the head at long distance by a British Fe-2B gunner, and he never really recovered. The wound never healed, but he continued to fly and fight after a leave.
Faced with a renewed Allied threat, the Germans raised the stakes with a new fighter plane, the Fokker Dreidecker 1. With a maximum speed of 103 miles an hour, the DR-1 was slower than its contemporaries. But what made it exceptional was its maneuverability. That was down to its triple-layered wings that were guided in flight by a reinforced lightweight rudder and large rear elevators. Able to roll and loop with relative ease in the hands of a skilled pilot, its maneuverability made it the aircraft of choice for the freshly recovered Baron von Richthofen.
This is the Fokker DR-1, the Red Baron. He flew this DR-1. He flew very small circles, and that's why it was very successful in combat.
Assigned his own squadron, the 25-year-old commander surrounded himself with aces.
Manfred von Richthofen is Belker's most apt pupil. Richthofen himself follows Belker's dicta to the limit. He collects these excellent airmen. He continues this squadron of aces in what's called Jasta 11, or Jagdstaffel, which is a hunting pack, as the Germans say.
Buoyed by success, von Richthofen boldly painted his triplane, and his defiant squadron of aces followed suit. The Red Baron had been born. In the skies, his fearsome force would come to be known as von Richthofen's Flying Circus.
Richthofen's plane is bright red. They all have these spectacularly colored individual fighters.
The whole purpose was really, notice me, I'm coming. It wasn't camouflage, anything like that, because there were such bright colours, blues and reds and all sorts of things. And it was, look, I'm a part of the Flying Circus. I'm a part of Richthofen's group. Look out.
By 1917, 1918, there may be as many as 60 fighters stacked. And this is how they appear, and they don't come over the Allied lines. The Germans fight on the defensive. So when the Allies come over in their offensives, they will find the sky stacked to the heavens with all these fighter planes and ready to fight.
In April 1917, the Allied army launched the Battle of Arras. The aim was for ground troops to advance on the German defences surrounding the small French town. To support the British offensive, 25 squadrons and 385 aircraft flew into the fray. For the British Royal Flying Corps, it would be known as Bloody April.
Bloody April is a period in 1917 when the Royal Flying Corps operating over the Western Front suffers heavy casualties, in part due to tactics, in part due to technology. Technology has moved on and the Germans seem to have better aircraft at this point in time.
The Allies lost 245 aircraft that April, and von Richthofen's flying Circus seemed invincible. The seasoned flyer's personal kill rate climbed ominously. But as the war entered its final phase, the Red Baron himself proved to be a mere mortal.
Richthofen, by early 1918, is practically exhausted. He's been fighting since 1916. The wound that he sustained in 1917 never completely healed, but he, as all the German fighter pilots and many of the Allied fighter pilots, refused to stop flying.
On the 21st of April 1918, Baron von Richthofen took off flying westward along the Somme Valley. A furious dogfight raged below. He circled, then swooped down on a lone Sopwith Camel, flown by a rookie pilot, Lieutenant Wilfrid May.
Baron Richthofen simply targeted him, and he got on his tail. Well, May tried to do everything to shake him off. He was tenacious. He couldn't shake him. He could not shake him.
May took evasive action, turning and diving until he ran out of sky. He skimmed down across the Somme Valley, von Richthofen's guns hot on his heels.
Richthofen pursues him lower and lower over the lines, not watching that he's coming over ground gunners, Australian gunners on the ground, and that he's also being pursued by Captain Roy Brown in a Sopwith Camel.
Brown and his Camel closed in and opened fire. The Dreidecker was hit, exploded, and the Red Baron went down in flames. But who actually took the fatal shot remains to this day a mystery.
There's actually some debate about how the Red Baron actually met his end. Some would put it down to a Canadian pilot called Brown, but in recent years, people have generally thought that it was actually ground fire from Australian troops in the trenches that actually brought down his aircraft.
He was on the ground, landed his plane, although he shouldn't have been able to, he should have been dead, and his final words were, kaput. And that's it, and he died.
Manfred von Richthofen claimed 80 Allied kills and was immortalised as the deadliest ace of World War I. The Red Baron may have been killed, but the Germans still ruled the skies. To gain air supremacy and win the war, the Allies still needed to improve its aircraft. Thanks to innovation and invention, the British Royal Aircraft Factory created the best fighter yet, the SE-5.
The SE-5A was one of the most successful fighters of the First World War. With over 5,000 produced alongside the Sopwith Camel, it was the mainstay of the Royal Flying Corps.
First introduced in March 1917, the SE-5 was state-of-the-art. Easier to fly than its contemporary, the Sopwith Camel, the SE-5 didn't have the fearsome rotary engine that threatened to flip over the plane at any moment. Equipped with an inline V8 water-cooled piston engine, it produced 150 horsepower. That's about the same as a mid-size car today. The SE-5 had a top speed of 138 miles per hour. Armed typically with a synchronized forward-firing Vickers machine gun and a Lewis gun in the rear, the SE-5 was a formidable fighting machine.
Its combination of characteristics such as being sturdy, maneuverability, and good armament made it a very good mount as an aircraft. Of course, combined with this was the quality of the pilots that were flying them.
thanks to bold technical innovations. By 1917, the Allies were finally fielding aircraft capable of competing with the enemy. Fighter planes like the SE-5 and the Sopwith Camel enabled the Allies to begin to wrest control of the skies. With a pack of brand new fighter aircraft and some victories in hand, the British finally had some aces of their own. One of the best, and most unlikely, was James McCudden.
James McCudden is one of the great British aces. McCudden is associated with the SE-5. That's his favorite platform. And what McCudden likes to do is to hunt alone.
James McCudden was one of the Royal Flying Corps' leading aces in the First World War. He had a confirmed victory list of 57 enemy aircraft. He became a mechanic in the Royal Flying Corps, and then during 1916 he becomes an observer and then latterly a pilot. And he's eventually posted to number 56 Squadron.
Despite McCudden's success, he wasn't fully accepted into the flying elite.
What we know now is that a number of men in 56 were really reluctant to have him as a squadron commander because he didn't fit the notion of a public school boy. You know, he was not wealthy, he didn't come from a very good family. He came from a lower middle class military family.
First pilots were most likely to be more from moneyed backgrounds because they would have had the money to have indulged in aviation as a sport before the war. But obviously as the war progresses and the need for more pilots arises, you do get pilots rising through the ranks, and it's really a certain ruthlessness more than anything else, along with a key aptitude for flying aircraft that makes the most successful pilots.
On the 23rd of September 1917, McCudden and his squadron were on a routine mission over Belgium on the Western Front when they encounter a formidable German ace.
James McCudden, alongside other pilots in number 56 Squadron, coming up against one of Germany's leading aces, Lieutenant Werner Voss, with a confirmed 48 kills.
Werner Voss challenged 6 of them in the air to a dogfight flying a Fokker triplane.
Voss could have escaped at any time. He put up an incredible battle. He fired at the British planes, he damaged the British planes.
Voss successfully dodged around McCudden and his pilots for 10 minutes. Then the Germans' propeller failed. British ace Rhys Davids dropped behind Voss and shot him down.
Jimmy McCudden said it was the greatest fight he'd ever been involved in. Even though he didn't do the shooting down, Rhys Davids did, but that was McCudden's greatest fight, as he reckoned anyway. It was teamwork between the 6 pilots.
James McCudden, however, would meet a cruel end.
What a number of observers thought was that he was basically about to do a stunt. His plane rose, they thought maybe he was going to pull up and come over. Nobody knows what happened, but it seems as though the engine quit and he crashed.
When he went down, they found that he'd undone his harness, his safety harness, because he was frightened of plane catching fire, and he had undone his harness so that if it landed, he could leap out quickly. It didn't catch fire, but it crashed much harder than he ever thought, and he was thrown out of the aircraft and was found bleeding from the nose and from the mouth, fractured skull. Was taken to hospital and died the following day.
With power finely balanced between Britain and Germany in the autumn of 1917, it was a loss the Allies could ill afford. To beat the Germans and end the brutal war, the Allied leaders realized they needed more than raw courage. What they needed were sheer numbers. Aircraft production went into overdrive. Over 5,200 SE-5s were built in just 18 months.
As the war continues, it becomes a mass aerial war of attrition, and the attitude is you give your opponent no mercy whatsoever. The objective is to kill him so that he won't kill you.
In 1918, with the Allies producing more and more combat-ready aircraft and gaining control of the skies, the Germans needed to regain the technological edge. The answer would be the most feared plane of World War I, the Fokker D-7.
This was one of the last fighters of the war, and it was certainly the best fighter of the war. And one of the German generals said that after this airplane came out, it made aces out of novices, and that's true.
It had incredible speed and maneuverability. And there's no doubt about it, that machine would have been the greatest machine of the war.
This airplane flies beautifully compared to any other of the World War I airplanes that I've flown. It was most feared because when it came to the front, no one had ever seen anything like this before. It was developed with new airfoil technology. It generated better lift, it generated better speed, it was more maneuverable.
The D-7's ingenious designer, Anthony Fokker, had pushed the envelope. And once again, he advanced aerodynamic technology and raised the jeopardy for the Allied Air Force.
I have in my hand here a rib of a Sopwith Camel, and one of the things that you can see right away is how much shorter the lower wing is. You can tell how thin this airfoil is. This airfoil is much thicker, as well as the one on the upper wing. Now, what we realized in 1918 is that better airfoils were more curved on the upper surface, and they generated more lift. And you can make a shorter wing in chord that would generate the same amount of lift at this very long, so your roll rate is going to be higher because you're not dragging this huge wing around through the air. So that increased your maneuverability.
The Fokker D-7's exceptional design allowed it to do something that no other World War I aircraft could.
The Fokker has the ability to hang on its prop and fire up into the underside of an airplane. The Fokker at 20,000 feet can actually hang on the engine prop at an angle and fire up into you, underneath you, and you'll never see it.
Key to the D-7's lethal edge over its adversaries was a BMW 185 horsepower high compression engine.
When put in the Fokker D-7, halves its rate of climb. In other words, to altitude, it would take 30 minutes to get to altitude. With BMW engine, it takes 15 minutes, which means that all the way to the end of the war, the Germans have an airplane that can always maintain altitude advantage above them, so it always has the advantage of attacking from above. And if you want to follow Burke's dicta, this is the perfect plane to do it in.
The sight of the Fokker D-7's straight wings approaching struck fear into the hearts of Allied pilots. But one aviator famously dared to take on 5 Fokker D-7s. Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace of aces.
Eddie Rickenbacker seemed to be quite a vibrant character, and he's quite well known as a racing car driver as much as a pilot.
What makes a racing driver special? Love of speed, willingness to take risks, fine judgment. All of those things Eddie brought to piloting. Bear in mind, Eddie Rickenbacker, in a period of about 4 months, he shot down 26 enemy aircraft.
Former American racing driver Eddie Rickenbacker flew the high-performance World War I fighter, the French Spad Mark 8.
They're the fastest planes, fighter planes of the war, at over 135 miles an hour speed. They're sturdy, they're excellent gun platforms because they're so stable. They can zoom and dive. They may not be as maneuverable as a Sopwith Camel or a Fokker DR-1 triplane, but they're faster. They can attack you from above, so they're superior machines to those.
On September the 18th, 1918, Rickenbacker, the commander of America's 94th Squadron, was flying alone when he ran into 7 enemy fighters. Among the pack were 5 of the dreaded German Fokker D-7s. Now that Allied pilots were also versed in Belka's rules, the US aviator was more than ready to engage. And with the sun behind, Rickenbacker dropped down and onto the tail of the D-7.
Came down out of the sun, he shot down one of the Fokkers before it knew what it hit it.
With their comrade going down in flames, the rest of the D-7s scattered. In the dogfighting melee that followed, Rickenbacker dropped onto a slow-moving LVG.
Eddie then shot down one of the reconnaissance planes and then headed for home. So it was an incredible feat, you know. He was taking on 7 aircraft, just one man.
It completed a textbook execution of Belker's rules of engagement. And the day belonged to the American ace. During World War I, Eddie Rickenbacker chalked up 26 kills and was later awarded the United States Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions. Thanks to the courage and skill of Allied aces and the mass mobilization and production of ever-improving fighter planes, the balance of power in the air war had shifted decisively.
The turning point actually comes when the Allies, who are going to produce far more airplanes than the Germans, when they get this superior set of airplanes, and it means that 1918, they're going to be able to overwhelm the Germans in the air. At the end of the war, the Germans are still technologically productive, but it's too late by that time. They've lost the war. The Allies have air supremacy.
The Armistice Agreement, signed on November the 11th, 1918, ended the First World War. In it, a special provision demanding that the Germans surrender all the surviving Fokker D-7s.
There was something magic about this airplane, and we desperately wanted these airplanes. We wanted to tear them apart, we wanted to reverse engineer them, and try to find out why this airplane was such a good airplane. The only weapon that was mentioned in the armistice was the Fokker D-7.
Out of the First World War, there's no doubt about it in my mind that aircraft development, wow, it just shot way beyond what anybody ever thought was possible.
In the course of the Great War from 1914 to 1918, the aeroplane had developed from humble beginnings. From planes built for reconnaissance with no instruments and no defenses, to becoming combat-ready fighter planes, sophisticated war machines, aerial warfare had come of age.